Bonjour. Pardonnez-moi, mais le business des podcasts est si nouveau que c'est difficile d'expliquer en anglais. So I'm going to continue much less in French. So I'm going to continue in English. I'm Erik Diehn. I am the CEO of Stitcher. We are a podcast platform. We produce, we sell, we distribute podcasts in the United States. I'm here today. I've got about 10 minutes. I'm going to explain the US podcast market to you. I'm going to tell you why it's a big deal, how it's gotten to the size that it's gotten, and hopefully I will give you some sense of why it's important for you to invest in podcasts, for why you should create podcasts and nurture them here in France. I love podcasts. I love to see them flourish throughout the entire world. So let me get started. It hasn't always been this way. Podcasts are a big deal in the US right now, but 10 years ago, nobody was listening. I mean, nobody. Podcasts were this weird little backwater in the US media industry. Only about 1 in 10 people actually listen to podcasts on a monthly basis, and frankly, only about a quarter of the US even knew what a podcast was. So nobody was listening. Within about 5 years, the industry had grown. We'd started to get some traction. We had some professionalization. People were making better shows. We were set up so that about a year later, by 2014, we could have a show called Serial, which became a breakout hit. And suddenly podcasts entered the national conversation, so that today we're at a point where 73 million people listen to podcasts in the US on a monthly basis. By contrast, only about 110 million people voted in the recent midterm elections. So we have almost as many podcast listeners as voters. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but we're close. And more importantly, the majority of Americans know what a podcast is. That means the growth potential is huge. There are a lot of people who know what podcasts are, but they're not listening yet. So why? Why did we grow from that little niche that we were 10 years ago to something that's really an important part of the overall media ecosystem? Well, where you have audience, you also have revenue. And we started with a trickle. Really, back 10 years ago, there was no podcast revenue. Even as recently as 2015, total podcast ad revenue in the US was about $70 million. This year, we're on track to exceed, I think, $400 million in total ad sales in the US. I think we're on track to be a billion-dollar business within the next 4 to 5 years. Again, most of that is ad sales. I'll talk about subscriptions in a little bit. So how did we get here? Well, let's take a step back and think about the state of terrestrial radio, meaning regular broadcast radio in the United States, particularly commercial terrestrial radio. We have something called public radio in the US, which is nonprofit radio. But if you look at terrestrial radio and you think about the voices that you could find in terrestrial radio, they were generally white, male, older. They were not particularly diverse, and they appealed to a fairly large, homogeneous, and profitable segment of the audience, which is generally older, white males with a conservative political leaning. They were not serving a broader set of US demographics, so there was just a whole swath of people in the US who didn't listen to talk radio, again, NPR being the exception. By contrast, podcasts started out as this little niche, right? Just a couple of comedy shows and some shows from public radio, but with very few barriers to entry, with the ability to suddenly create a show and have that show reach a scale audience quickly via digital distribution. All of a sudden, you could start making shows for audiences that were not served by terrestrial radio, and very quickly, the ecosystem started to flourish. We started to get categories and types of shows that could not have been imagined by broadcast radio, right? So not just the traditional kind of interview shows and talk shows, but improv comedy, long-form and short-form sports shows, long-form documentaries, really incredible reporting on subjects that simply hadn't been tackled in an audio form in years and years in the US. And it's not just amateurs anymore. It's major media organizations, the New York Times, people like Preet Bharara, who used to be a district attorney, a prosecutor in the US, now talking about politics. People doing incredible high production value content. Wolverine is a show that we did with professional actors, 6-figure budgets. So podcasts are now a very real media form, and there are lots and lots of large organizations involved in it. And as a result, we're getting big name stars. Oprah Winfrey has a podcast, right? We have ex-politicians, we have people from the New York Times, we have actors. And the constellation of voices is reaching a set of demographics, again, that's far broader than anything that terrestrial radio ever reached. So we're serving audiences that simply didn't listen before. And again, where you have audience, you have revenue. More than that, when people find these voices, when they find these voices that speak to them, there's this incredible intimacy, there's this engagement that happens in podcasting. When you're listening to a podcast, you're listening on this, in all likelihood, and you're listening through an earbud, and the host's voice is literally in your ear, right next to your brain. And that level of engagement creates a trust, creates a level of intimacy, which allows our primary ad product, the host-read spot, to flourish. Now, before I go into that, let me take a quick step back. Speaking of the phone, the industry would not be possible without this phone, right? And if you look at the growth of the podcast industry, it mirrors very closely smartphone penetration in the US. And what happened in 2014, we kind of bounced along for a little while. In 2014, Apple decided to make the podcast app a default app on the phone. And when they did that, all of a sudden, everybody had a means to listen to podcasts. It was right there when they bought their phone. As a result, the podcast industry, podcast distribution, has been heavily skewed towards Apple and towards iOS for many years. One byproduct of that is that Apple is not an ad-driven company. They do not really make money off of podcasts. They don't have an ad tech infrastructure. They're serious about privacy. They don't share information with third parties. There's no cookies. So we started out with this growing audience, this growing interest in podcasts, and no way to monetize them via traditional paths. We didn't have the infrastructure to serve them programmatic advertising or targeted advertising. So we created this thing called the host-read spot, which is really just a throwback to radio spots of old, where the host reads an advertisement. But the thing is, when you've got this incredibly engaged audience, and you've got this trust for the host, and you've got the host talking about the product, or you've got the producers of the show talking about the product, people pay attention. And advertising in the US, audio advertising at that point in time, really was garbage. I mean, if you listen to an ad on the radio, it was some guy screaming about interest rates, or it was somebody talking about how this crazy taco from Taco Bell was amazing. And people listened to those and they tuned them out. Nobody listened to audio ads. By contrast, I'm going to play you a quick host-read spot from a show called Today Explained. This is a show that we produce with Vox. Vox is a large and growing news organization in the United States. This was on One Monday show in September.
Tom's has brick-and-mortar stores in several American cities, Los Angeles, Chicago, Austin, Portland, and they're going to open one in Brooklyn this fall. But also, they're on the internet. And you can find shoes at toms.com/explained that come with a 15% discount if it's your first purchase at that website.
Then the next day, they do this ad.
Vanderplug.
Yeah.
You listened to the show yesterday.
Oh, yeah.
You hear the ads?
Tom's.
And that's why I have you here right now, is to talk about Tom's with me, because as you can see,
You got a big box.
I got a big box.
Honestly, a box that size, it could be anything.
How many shoes do you think are in here?
I'm honestly, it could be hundreds.
I mean, hundreds of baby shoes, maybe.
I'm sorry, are baby shoes not shoes anymore?
Let's find out together.
Oh, there's another box in there.
This is like Inception. There's boxes within boxes.
Oh, you got to be kidding me. What else is in there?
That's-
Whoa.
Count them.
That's 2 boxes.
So that's the host of the show, and this is a serious news show. That week's episodes were about the Mueller investigation. I think they were about the Kavanaugh confirmation in the United States. They were about white-collar crime. But the host has this very playful nature, and so when he reads a spot, he can jump out of that serious content and into the ad, and people pay attention. And we know they pay attention because we've surveyed them. We've surveyed hundreds of thousands of podcast listeners. We've asked them, what types of ads do you pay attention? Traditional media formats, display ads, TV, billboards, radio commercials, they only pay attention about a third of the time. Podcast ads, our respondents tell us they pay attention 80% of the time. They don't skip ads either. We only see about a 15 to 20% skip rate. So they're engaged, they're paying attention. As a result, CPMs are higher than in traditional media. Radio CPMs in the US right now, maybe 5 to 10, a little bit more. Traditional TV, including cable and broadcast, 10 to 25. Podcast ad CPMs, $15 to $45. The average is about 20 to 25. They actually go higher than that, but those are extreme cases. So it's a premium ad spot, and as a result, we're making much more money. And it's not just tiny little brands. Certainly, to start out, what you heard there was a shoe company, Tom's, which is doing what's called a direct response ad, where they're trying to get the audience to do something, buy a shoe, right? Go to this website and buy a shoe. And in the early days, those small, digitally focused, direct-to-consumer startups were a huge source of our growth. People like Bonobos, who really pioneered the direct-to-consumer fashion and commerce model in the United States. Casper, you may have heard of the mattress company, a giant mattress company that's disrupted mattresses in the US. Others in other categories. Well, these people started out, but then all of a sudden the incumbents they were disrupting took notice and said, we need to be in podcast ads too. So over the past few years, it's shifted from these two major brands in all sorts of new categories, right? Financial services, consumer products, travel, technology. And these are not small buys either. These are 6-figure and sometimes 7-figure buys, renewals. This is now an industry that has tons of brand advertising in the US.
Erik, maybe one last slide, and then
And this is my last slide.
you will be on the roundtable. So
And what's next? Well, we're going to talk in a second about subscription models, about other ways to monetize. We are moving away from that world of RSS distribution of Apple Podcasts. There are now platforms involved in this space. People like us, Stitcher, who are purely focused on the podcast space. People like Pandora and Spotify, who are integrating podcasts into their offering. We're going to bring things like programmatic, better recommendation, and other revenue streams into the space and continue to grow it past $1 billion. So that's podcasts. I hope I covered it all in 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Erik. You stay on the roundtable. There might be some more questions.